The blood came in the night, and with it, the last fragile thread of hope that had been keeping Julia Carmichael tethered to something resembling normalcy shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She woke in the pre-dawn darkness of their small ranch house outside Ardmore, Oklahoma, feeling the familiar warmth spreading between her legs, and she knew without having to light the lamp what had happened. The third time in 12 months. The third baby she would never hold, never nurse, never watch, grow into the person they were meant to become. She lay perfectly still in the bed she shared with no one, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams while silent tears tracked down her temples and into her hair, and she wondered if God had simply decided that she was not meant to be a mother at all. By the time the sun rose over the red Oklahoma dirt in July of 1883, Julia had cleaned herself up, changed the bedding, and was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she could not bring herself to drink. She was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. The ranch her father had left her when he died 2 years ago sprawled across 80 acres of decent grazing land, with a small herd of cattle that needed tending, and a vegetable garden that was currently being choked by weeds because she had not had the energy to care for it in weeks. She had been so certain this time, so careful. She had done everything the doctor in town had suggested, had rested more, had prayed until her knees ached from kneeling on the hard wooden floor of the little church on Sundays. And still, her body had betrayed her. The sound of hoofbeats approaching the house pulled her from her spiral of grief. Julia set down the untouched coffee and moved to the front door, opening it to see a tall figure on horseback silhouetted against the morning sun. She raised a hand to shade her eyes and recognized Henry Vaughn, the cowboy who worked the neighboring ranch to the west. He was leading a horse that was limping badly, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, Miss Carmichael," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the dusty yard. "Sorry to bother you so early, but this mare threw a shoe about a mile back, and your place was closer than heading back to the Morrison spread. Was hoping I might trouble you for some water while I check her hoof." Julia nodded, not trusting her voice yet. She watched as Henry dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was perhaps 27 or 28, tall and lean, with the kind of quiet competence that seemed to emanate from men who worked with animals and the land. She had seen him in town a few times over the past year, had exchanged polite greetings at church, but they had never really spoken beyond pleasantries. He worked for Samuel Morrison, who owned the largest cattle operation in the area, and he had a reputation as one of the best horsemen in the territory. "There is a pump by the barn," Julia managed to say, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Help yourself." Henry studied her for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. His eyes, which were a startling shade of blue even in the morning light, showed concern. "You all right, madam?" "Fine," she lied, and the word came out too quickly, too sharp. She softened her tone. "Thank you for asking. I will bring you some water for yourself." She retreated into the house before he could respond, leaning against the closed door and taking several deep breaths. She could not fall apart in front of a stranger. She could not. She had already cried enough tears to fill the Canadian River that ran south of town, and more tears would not bring back what she had lost. She poured water from the pitcher into a tin cup and carried it outside, finding Henry crouched beside the mare, examining her front left hoof. "Looks like she picked up a stone as well," he said, glancing up at her as she approached. "Nothing serious, but I want to make sure there is no bruising before I walk her home." Julia held out the cup, and he stood to take it, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact was insignificant, barely a touch at all, but something about it made her throat tighten. He drank deeply, then handed the cup back with a nod of thanks. "I appreciate your kindness," he said. Then, after a pause, "Are you sure you are all right? You look like you have not slept." The gentle concern in his voice was her undoing. Julia felt her carefully constructed composure crack, and before she could stop herself, she was speaking. "I lost another baby last night. The third one. In a year." The words hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Henry's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, something that looked like genuine sorrow. He set down the cup on the edge of the water trough and took a step closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. "I am so sorry," he said, and his voice was quiet but steady. "That is a grief no one should have to bear, let alone 3 times over." Julia felt the tears coming and could not stop them. She turned away, ashamed to be breaking down in front of this man she barely knew, but Henry moved around to face her. Without asking permission, without hesitation, he opened his arms and pulled her against his chest. She stiffened for a moment, shocked by the intimacy of the gesture from someone who was essentially a stranger. But then the dam broke completely, and she sobbed into his shirt while he held her and said nothing at all, which was exactly what she needed. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Julia pulled back, mortified. "I am sorry. I should not have done that. I do not even know you." "Sometimes that makes it easier," Henry said gently. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture so tender that it made her heart ache in a different way. Grief is not something we should have to carry alone. No one should face that kind of loss by themselves. "I have been alone for 2 years," Julia heard herself saying, "since my father died. This ranch, this life, it is all I have left of him. And I thought if I could have a child, if I could bring new life into this place, then maybe it would not feel so empty. But my body will not cooperate. 3 times I've been pregnant, and 3 times I've lost them before they were even real enough to bury." Henry's jaw tightened, and she saw the muscle there flex. They were real. Every single one of them was real, and your grief for them is valid. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. She looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. His face was weathered from years in the sun, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed almost out of place in the harsh landscape of the Oklahoma Territory. There were depths there she had not expected, a capacity for understanding that surprised her. "You talk like you know something about loss," she said softly. "Everyone in the West knows about loss," Henry replied. "It is part of living out here, but that does not make it easier. It just means we understand why we need each other." The mare stamped her hoof and whinnied, breaking the moment. Henry turned his attention back to the horse, and Julia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the morning heat beginning to build despite the early hour. The Oklahoma summer was relentless, turning the land brown and dusty, and the heat seemed to press down on everything with an almost physical weight. "Where is the husband who helped create these babies?" Henry asked as he worked on clearing the stone from the mare's hoof. His tone was carefully neutral, but Julia heard the question beneath the question. "There is no husband," she said quietly. "I was engaged. Thomas Brennan. He was a rancher from Texas, came up here to buy cattle from my father 3 years ago. We fell in love, or I thought we did. He went back to Texas to settle his affairs and sell his land there, planning to come back and marry me. But on the way back, his wagon overturned crossing a river during a flood. They found his body 2 days later." Henry stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "But you said you were pregnant. 3 times. Julia felt her face flush. "After he died, I was lost, grieving. A traveling salesman came through town about 6 months later. He was handsome and charming, and he said all the right things, and I was lonely enough and hurt enough to believe him. He promised to marry me, said he would settle down, give up the traveling life. I gave myself to him because I wanted to feel something other than grief." She laughed bitterly. "He left town the next morning without even saying goodbye. I found out I was pregnant a month later. When I lost that baby, I thought maybe it was for the best. What kind of life could I have given a child conceived in such foolishness?" "That was not foolishness," Henry said firmly. "That was a man taking advantage of a woman in pain. There is a difference." "Maybe," Julia said. "But the other 2 times there was no man at all. I had hope from that first pregnancy, even though it ended in loss, so I went to Denver 6 months ago to visit my aunt. I met a banker there, a widower. We spent time together, and I thought maybe there could be something. We were intimate once, and I came home pregnant again. He wrote me letters for a few weeks. Then they stopped. I lost that baby at 3 months. She took a shaky breath. The third time, I went to a dance in town 4 months ago. There was a cowboy passing through working a cattle drive. We talked, we danced, we went for a walk. One thing led to another. I knew better by then, but I was so desperate to have a child, to have someone to love and care for, that I let it happen anyway, and this time I made it to almost 4 months before my body rejected the baby. Henry was quiet for a long moment, still crouched by the mare. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. You have been trying to fill the emptiness with babies that you hoped would give your life meaning again. Yes, Julia whispered, and I have failed every time. He stood up and walked over to her, the mare's reins in his hand. You have not failed. Sometimes our bodies do not work the way we want them to, and that is not a moral failing. It is just life being hard and unfair. But trying to create life with men who do not love you, who are not committed to you, that is a path to more heartbreak. I know, Julia said, and the admission felt like a confession. I know that now. But I was so desperate. I am still desperate. I do not know how to live with this emptiness. Henry reached out and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. You live with it by not trying to live with it alone. You let people help you. You build a life that has meaning beyond just being a mother, even though I know that is what you want. And you give yourself time to heal before you try to move forward. You sound very wise for a cowboy, Julia said, and there was no mockery in her voice, only genuine observation. I've had my own losses, Henry said. Different from yours, but losses all the same. My parents died of cholera when I was 16. My older brother died in the war. I had a younger sister who died of fever when she was just 8 years old, and I was the one taking care of her when it happened. I blamed myself for years. Thought if I had been smarter or faster or better, I could have saved her. It took me a long time to understand that some things are just beyond our control. Julia squeezed his hand. I am sorry for your losses. And I am sorry for yours, Mars, he said. But here is what I have learned. The people we lose do not want us to stop living. They want us to find joy again, even if it takes time. They want us to open our hearts to new possibilities, new connections, and they want us to know that we are worthy of love and happiness, even when we do not feel like we are. I do not feel worthy, Julia admitted. I feel broken. You are not broken, Henry said, and his voice was so certain that she almost believed him. You are grieving, and that is different. Grief is not a permanent state, even when it feels like it will never end. It changes over time. It becomes something you carry with you instead of something that carries you. They stood there in the dusty yard, hands joined, while the sun climbed higher in the Oklahoma sky. The mare shifted her weight and blew out a soft breath, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its bright, cascading song. Julia felt something shift inside her chest, a small easing of the tight band of pain that had been constricting her breathing for months. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked. You do not know me. You have your own life, your own work to do. Maybe that is exactly why, Henry said, because sometimes kindness from a stranger is easier to accept than kindness from people who know us. And because I can see that you are drowning, and I know what that feels like. If I can throw you a rope, even just for a few minutes, then maybe it will be enough to keep you afloat until you can find your own way to shore. Julia felt tears welling up again, but these felt different somehow. Less like despair, and more like release. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything, Henry told her, but I will tell you this. You are not alone in your grief, and you do not have to face the future by yourself unless you want to. There are good people in this world, people who would count it a privilege to know you and care about you. You just have to let them in. He released her hand and stepped back, checking the mare's hoof one more time. She should be all right to walk back to the Morrison place, but I would like to come by again tomorrow, if that would be acceptable to you. Check on you, make sure you are doing all right. Maybe help with some of the ranch work I can see has been piling up. Julia wanted to refuse out of pride, but the truth was she desperately needed help. And more than that, she realized she wanted to see him again. There was something about Henry Vaughn that made her feel less alone, and that was a feeling she had not experienced in a very long time. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you." Henry smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "Then I will see you tomorrow morning, Miss Carmichael." "Julia," she said, please call me Julia." "Julia," he repeated, and the way he said her name felt like a promise. "I am Henry." "I know," she said, and found herself smiling back despite everything. He mounted the mare carefully, testing her weight on the injured hoof. When he seemed satisfied, he touched his hat brim again and turned the horse toward the west. Julia watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon, and then she went back into the house and sat down at the kitchen table and cried again, but this time the tears felt different. This time, they felt like the beginning of healing instead of the continuation of breaking. The rest of that day passed in a haze. Julia forced herself to eat something, then went out to check on her small herd of cattle. They were grazing peacefully in the south pasture, and she counted them automatically, making sure none had wandered off or fallen victim to predators or disease. Everything seemed in order, which was something of a miracle given how little attention she had paid to the ranch over the past few months. Her father's legacy deserved better than her neglect, and that realization stung. She spent the afternoon pulling weeds in the vegetable garden, losing herself in the simple physical labor. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning her skin pink despite her bonnet, and her hands were soon covered in dirt and blisters. But there was something therapeutic about the work, something grounding about having her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the earth even as she mourned the lives that had been taken from her. As the sun began to set, painting the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and purple and deep red, Julia sat on the porch steps and looked out over the land her father had built from nothing. He had come to the Oklahoma Territory in 1875, right after it had been opened to settlement, and he had claimed this piece of earth and made it productive through sheer force of will and endless hard work. He had raised Julia alone after her mother died, giving birth to a son who had not survived, and he had never remarried, pouring all his love and energy into his daughter and his land. She wondered what he would think of her now if he could see how she had been living for the past year. Would he be disappointed in her choices, in the way she had sought comfort in the arms of men who did not love her? Or would he understand the desperate loneliness that had driven her to such decisions? She wanted to believe he would understand, but she could not be sure. That night, Julia lay in bed with her hands on her flat stomach, mourning the life that had so briefly existed there. She had never gotten far enough along to feel the baby move, but she had felt pregnant, had experienced the nausea and fatigue and strange food cravings that seemed to be universal among expectant mothers, and she had let herself hope, let herself imagine a future with a child in it. A future where this house was filled with laughter and noise instead of silence and solitude. But that future was gone now, just like the two before it. And as Henry had suggested, maybe it was time to stop trying to force something that clearly was not meant to be, at least not in the way she had been going about it. Maybe it was time to focus on healing herself instead of trying to fill the void with something external. She fell asleep thinking about the cowboy who had held her while she cried, and for the first time in months, her dreams were not nightmares. Henry Vaughn arrived at her ranch the next morning just after sunrise, riding a different horse this time, a sturdy bay gelding that looked like it could work all day without tiring. He had a worn leather saddlebag slung over the horse's rump, and when he dismounted, Julia saw that he moved with a slight limp that she had not noticed the day before. "Old injury," he said when he caught her looking. "Bull caught me wrong about 5 years ago, broke my hip in 3 places. Healed up mostly fine, but it gets stiff when I have been in the saddle too long." You did not have to come, Julia said, though she was glad he had. She had spent the morning cleaning the house and changing into her better work dress, and she had even attempted to do something with her hair beyond just pulling it back into a simple knot. The effort felt silly in retrospect, but she could not quite bring herself to regret it. I said I would, so here I am, Henry replied. I brought some tools I thought might be useful, and some supplies from the Morrison kitchen. Their cook, Rosa, insisted I bring you food, said no woman should be alone without proper meals. He hefted the saddlebag and carried it to the porch, where he began unpacking parcels wrapped in cloth. There was fresh bread, still warm from the oven, a crock of butter, a jar of strawberry preserves, some dried beef, and a small pot of what looked like stew. This is too much, Julia protested. I cannot accept all this. You can and you will, Henry said firmly. Rosa would have my hide if I brought any of it back, and besides, you need to eat. You look like you have lost weight you could not afford to lose. Julia wanted to argue, but the truth was she was hungry, and the smell of the fresh bread was making her mouth water. She had been subsisting on hardtack and dried beans for weeks, too tired and grief-stricken to bother with proper cooking. Thank you, she said instead. Please thank Rosa for me as well. You can thank her yourself, Henry said. I'm sure she would love to meet you. She is always looking for more women to talk to, being surrounded by cowboys all day. They shared a simple breakfast on the porch, eating bread with butter and preserves and washing it down with strong coffee. Henry asked about the ranch, about what needed doing, and Julia found herself opening up about the work that had been neglected. The barn roof needed patching before the winter rains came. Several sections of fence were down or in need of repair. The cattle needed to be checked more thoroughly for signs of disease or injury. The vegetable garden needed serious attention. And the house itself could use some maintenance that she had been putting off. That is a lot for one person, Henry observed. Even one person who has not been dealing with grief and loss. I know, Julia admitted. I have been thinking about hiring help, but I do not have much money to spare. My father left the ranch to me free and clear, but there was not much cash to go along with it. What little I had has been going to basic supplies and the doctor bills. Henry was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. Then he said, What if I helped you? Not for money, but as a neighbor. I could come by in the mornings before my shift at the Morrison Ranch, or in the evenings after. Help with the heavy work, the things that are hard for one person to manage alone. I could not ask you to do that, Julia said immediately. You have your own work, your own life. You're not asking. I am offering, Henry pointed out, and the truth is, I would welcome the extra activity. Working for Morrison is steady and the pay is decent, but it is not mine, you know. I do not have a stake in it beyond my wages. Helping you build up this place, that would feel different, that would feel meaningful. Julia looked at him, trying to understand what he was really saying. Why would helping me be meaningful to you? We barely know each other. Henry met her gaze steadily. Because yesterday I watched you break down under the weight of more grief than anyone should have to carry. And instead of turning away or judging you, I felt like I wanted to help carry some of that weight. Because I've spent the last 10 years working other people's land and living in a bunkhouse with a dozen other men, and I'm tired of not having something of my own to care about. And because when I look at you, I see someone who is brave and strong and trying her best in impossible circumstances, and that is someone worth knowing better. The honesty in his words took Julia's breath away. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not such direct vulnerability. You do not know if I am brave or strong, she said softly. I have made so many mistakes. Mistakes do not make you weak, Henry said. They make you human. And the fact that you are still here, still trying to move forward, still taking care of this ranch even when you barely have the energy to take care of yourself, that tells me you are stronger than you think. Julia felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. If you really want to help, I would be grateful for it, but I insist on feeding you whenever you are here. I may not have much, but I can at least provide meals. Deal, Henry said, and held out his hand. She shook it, and his grip was firm and warm and somehow reassuring. They spent the rest of the morning working on the barn roof. Henry climbed up with practiced ease despite his limp, and Julia handed up tools and supplies from below. He worked with efficient competence, replacing rotten boards and hammering down loose shingles, all while keeping up a steady stream of conversation that kept Julia engaged and distracted from her darker thoughts. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about the farm his parents had worked before the cholera took them. He talked about his time working various ranches across Kansas and Texas before settling in the Oklahoma Territory 3 years ago. He spoke about his dreams of one day having his own place, a small ranch where he could raise good horses and maybe some cattle. Nothing as big as the Morrison operation, but something that was his. In turn, Julia found herself talking about her childhood, about growing up with just her father after her mother died. She told him about learning to ride and rope and shoot because there was no one else to help with the ranch work. She talked about the loneliness of being the only girl in a world of men, and the way she had learned to be tough and independent because there was no other choice. And she talked about Thomas, about the love she had felt for him, and the devastation of losing him before their life together could even begin. That was when everything changed, she said, taking a break to wipe sweat from her forehead. The Oklahoma heat was oppressive, even in the shade of the barn. Before Thomas died, I felt like I had a future, a path forward. After he died, I just felt lost. And then when my father died 6 months later, I felt completely untethered from anything meaningful. That is when you started looking for something to anchor yourself to, Henry said from the roof. And you chose the idea of motherhood because it felt like something concrete, something that would give your life purpose. Yes, Julia said, but I went about it all wrong. I can see that now. I was trying to create meaning through biology instead of through connection. I was trying to have a baby, but I was not trying to build a life with anyone. I was not trying to find love again. I was just trying to fill the hole inside me. Henry climbed down from the roof and stood in front of her, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair tousled. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be a mother, but you are right that trying to do it alone, trying to do it with men who do not love you and are not committed to you, that was never going to work. Not because you are not capable, but because children deserve to be born into love and stability, not into grief and desperation. I know that now, Julia said, but knowing it does not make the wanting go away. I still want a child. I still want to be a mother. I just do not know if it will ever happen for me. Maybe it will, and maybe it would not, Henry said gently. But either way, your life can still have meaning. Your life can still be full and rich and worthwhile. You just have to find the right things to fill it with. Like what? Julia asked. Like this ranch. Like building something that lasts. Like friendships and community and connection with people who care about you. Like maybe eventually finding someone who loves you for who you are, not just for what you can give them. He paused, then added quietly, like maybe letting yourself be happy again, even if that happiness looks different from what you imagined. Julia felt tears prickling at her eyes again, but she blinked them back. You make it sound so simple. It is not simple at all, Henry admitted, but it is possible. I have seen people come back from grief that should have destroyed them. I have seen people build new lives after everything they knew was taken away. It happens. It just takes time and work and the willingness to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when you cannot see where the path is leading. They went back to work, and the rhythm of the labor was soothing. By the time the sun was directly overhead, they had finished with the worst of the barn roof repairs. Julia insisted on making lunch, and they ate cold stew and bread in the relative cool of the house while Henry told her funny stories about some of the cowboys he had worked with over the years. She found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. Henry had a gift for storytelling, a way of painting pictures with words that made even mundane events seem entertaining. And there was something about his presence that made her feel lighter, less burdened by the weight of her grief. After lunch, they moved on to fence repair, riding out to the far pasture where several sections had been knocked down by cattle or weather or both. Henry worked with quiet efficiency, showing Julia tricks for setting posts that would last longer and teaching her how to properly tension barbed wire so it would not sag over time. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked as they worked together to stretch wire between two posts. "From every ranch I've ever worked," Henry said. "Every foreman has their own way of doing things, and you pick up bits and pieces from all of them. The trick is figuring out which methods actually work best and which ones are just tradition for the sake of tradition." "My father had his own way of doing things too," Julia said. "But I was so young when I was learning that I did not always understand why he did things a certain way. Now I wish I had paid more attention, asked more questions, Rui." "You can still learn," Henry pointed out. "Knowledge is not something that disappears just because the person who had it is gone. There are books, other ranchers, people like me who are happy to share what they know. You do not have to figure everything out alone." They worked through the afternoon, and by the time the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, they had repaired 3 sections of fence and reinforced a 4th that had been looking shaky. Julia's hands were blistered, and her back ached, but she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for a long time. "You are a good worker," Henry said as they rode back toward the ranch house. "Strong and not afraid of hard labor. Your father taught you well?" "I had a good teacher," Julia said. "He never treated me like I was less capable just because I was a girl. He taught me everything he knew because he wanted me to be able to take care of myself no matter what happened." "He would be proud of you," Henry said quietly. "I did not know him, but from what you have told me, I think he would be proud of the woman you have become." Julia felt emotion swell in her throat. "Even with all my mistakes?" "Especially with your mistakes," Henry said, "because you made them while trying to survive, while trying to find your way through impossible grief. That takes courage, even when the choices are not always the right ones." They unsaddled the horses and turned them into the corral. Then Henry helped Julia carry water from the well for the animals. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the air was finally beginning to cool from the brutal heat of the day. "I should head back to the Morrison place," Henry said, though he did not sound particularly eager to leave. "Early morning comes fast, and I have a full day of work ahead of me tomorrow." "Will you come back?" Julia asked, and hated how vulnerable the question made her sound. "If you want me to," Henry said, looking at her with those steady blue eyes. "I do," Julia said simply. "I really do." Henry smiled, and in the fading light it looked almost tender. "Then I will be here. Same time tomorrow morning?" "Yes," Julia said. "Thank you, Henry, for everything. For yesterday, for today, for all of it." "You do not have to thank me," he said. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He mounted his horse and rode off into the gathering dusk, and Julia stood watching until he disappeared from sight. Then she went inside and lit the lamps and made herself a simple dinner from the supplies Rosa had sent. She ate slowly, actually tasting the food for the first time in weeks. And when she was done, she sat at the table and thought about the past 2 days. She had lost a baby. She had broken down in front of a stranger. She had revealed her deepest shames and failures to a man she barely knew. And somehow, instead of feeling more broken, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to heal. That night when she went to bed, she did not lie awake mourning. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately. And when she dreamed, it was of strong hands and kind eyes and a voice that said she was not alone. Henry came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Over the next 2 weeks, he became a fixture at the ranch, arriving before dawn and working for several hours before heading to his job at the Morrison place. Sometimes he came back in the evenings too, staying for dinner and talking with Julia until the stars came out. They worked side by side on all the projects the ranch needed. They finished the fence repairs, patched holes in the barn walls, cleared out the well that had been getting silty, and spent a full day organizing the tack room and equipment shed that had become chaotic over the past year. Henry taught Julia how to properly sharpen tools and maintain her saddles, and she taught him her father's techniques for reading cattle health and predicting weather patterns. But more than the work, they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and fears and hopes. Julia learned that Henry was 28 years old, that he had been saving money for years toward buying his own land, that he loved the Oklahoma Territory despite its harsh climate and rough edges because it represented possibility and new beginnings. She learned that he was a talented fiddle player, though he had not picked up his instrument in months because he had no one to play for. She learned that he had a deep love of horses and a gift for understanding them that bordered on uncanny. Henry learned that Julia was smarter than most men gave her credit for, that she could calculate cattle weights and market prices in her head faster than he could do it on paper. He learned that she loved to read but rarely had time for it, that she dreamed of traveling to places like San Francisco and New Orleans but doubted she ever would. He learned that she was funny and brave and more resilient than she believed herself to be. And slowly, tentatively, they began to care for each other in ways that went beyond friendship. It started with small things. Henry bringing her wildflowers he had picked on his ride over, Julia making his favorite foods for dinner after he mentioned them in passing, the way their hands would brush when they were working together, contact that lingered just a moment longer than necessary, the way Henry would look at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his expression soft and wondering, the way Julia found herself thinking about him during the hours when he was not there, counting down the time until she would see him again. 3 weeks after that first morning when he had held her while she cried, they were working together to move a stack of hay bales in the barn when the pile shifted unexpectedly. Julia stumbled backward and would have fallen if Henry had not caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her against him. They stood frozen for a moment, pressed together in the dusty shadows of the barn, and Julia could feel his heart beating against her back, could smell the clean scent of soap and horse and sun-warmed cotton that seemed to cling to him. "Are you all right?" Henry asked, his voice low and close to her ear. "Yes," Julia whispered, but she did not pull away. Instead, she turned in his arms until they were face to face, and she saw her own confused tangle of feelings reflected in his eyes. "Julia," he said, and her name sounded like a question. She answered by rising up on her toes and kissing him. For a heartbeat, Henry did not move, and Julia felt panic flood through her. She had misread everything, had made another terrible mistake, was about to be rejected and humiliated. But then his arms tightened around her, and he was kissing her back, his lips warm and firm and sure against hers. It was nothing like the desperate, empty encounters she had experienced over the past year. This was different. This was real. This felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory, when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for days, Mourning," he admitted, "but I did not want to push you, did not want you to think I was only here because I wanted something from you." "I have wanted it too," Julia confessed, "but I was afraid of making another mistake, afraid of trusting my judgment, afraid of what it would mean if I let myself care about you." "And now?" Henry asked. "Now I'm still afraid," Julia said honestly. "But I'm also tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. I care about you, Henry. I do not know when it happened or how, but somewhere in the past few weeks, you have become the best part of my days." "You are the best part of mine too," Henry said, and kissed her again, softer this time, more tender. They spent the rest of that day stealing kisses between chores, learning the shape and taste and feel of each other. And when evening came and Henry had to leave for the Morrison Ranch, they stood on the porch holding hands and neither wanted to let go. "I need to tell you something," Henry said finally, "something important." Julia felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I know it is fast. I know you are still healing from everything you have been through, but I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. It is not pity or obligation or some kind of rescue fantasy. It is love, or the beginning of it, and it is only going to grow stronger if we keep spending time together." Julia felt tears well up, but these were good tears, happy tears. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, and it terrifies me because I do not trust myself anymore. I have made so many bad choices about men, have been so wrong about what I thought were my feelings. How do I know this is real and not just me trying to fill the empty space inside me again?" Henry cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had spilled over. "Because this time you are not desperate. This time you are not trying to force something that is not there. This time you are healing, getting stronger, becoming whole again on your own. I am not a solution to your problems, Julia. I am just a man who sees you and values you and wants to be part of your life, whatever that life looks like." "How are you so wise?" Julia asked, half laughing, half crying. "I am not wise," Henry said. "I am just someone who has lived long enough to learn that the real things are always the simplest. Love is not complicated. It is caring about someone else's happiness as much as your own. It is wanting to be there for the good days and the bad days. It is choosing someone every single day because being with them makes you a better version of yourself." "I want that," Julia said. "I want all of that with you." "Then let's take it slow," Henry suggested. "Let's give ourselves time to build this right. No rushing, no pressure, just letting things develop naturally. We will keep working on the ranch, keep spending time together, keep learning about each other. And if this is real, if this is meant to last, then it will still be here in a month or 3 months or a year." Julia nodded, feeling something settle inside her. "That sounds perfect." Henry kissed her one more time, long and sweet, and then he mounted his horse and rode away into the purple twilight. Julia watched him go with her fingers pressed to her lips, and she felt something she had not felt in almost 2 years. She felt happy. The summer rolled on, hot and dry and relentless. Julia and Henry continued their routine of working together in the mornings, and now their evenings together stretched longer as their connection deepened. They were careful to honor their agreement to take things slow, but slow did not mean distant. They held hands while they walked the property. They kissed in the barn and on the porch, and in the shade of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek at the southern edge of the ranch. They talked about their future in careful, hypothetical terms, both afraid to jinx something that felt so precious and fragile. Henry introduced Julia to Rosa, the cook at the Morrison Ranch, and the older Mexican woman took one look at the two of them together and smiled knowingly. She began sending care packages home with Henry regularly, insisting that Julia needed to eat more, and she became a kind of surrogate mother figure to Julia, who had not had a woman's guidance in her life since her own mother died. Through Rosa, Julia met some of the other women in the area, the wives of ranchers and shopkeepers and cowboys who had settled down. She began going to town more often, attending church socials and quilting bees, slowly rebuilding a social life that had atrophied over the past year. It was uncomfortable at first being around people who might have heard gossip about her situation, but she discovered that most people were kinder than she had expected. Or perhaps they were just following the Western code of minding their own business, but either way she was grateful. In late August, Samuel Morrison himself came to visit Julia's ranch. He was a gruff, weathered man in his 60s, with a reputation for being tough but fair. He walked the property with Julia, asking her questions about the cattle and the land, and when they finished the tour, he stood on her porch and looked out over the view. "Henry tells me you have been working hard to get this place back in order," Morrison said. "He has been a tremendous help," Julia said carefully, not sure where this conversation was going. "He is a good man," Morrison said. "Best horseman I have got, and one of the most reliable workers I have ever employed, but he is not going to work for me forever. He has dreams of his own." "I know," Julia said. "He has told me about them." Morrison turned to look at her, his eyes sharp despite his age. "He has told me about you too. Says you are the strongest woman he has ever met, and the smartest. Coming from Henry, who does not give compliments lightly, that is high praise." Julia felt herself blush. "That is very kind of him." "It is honest," Morrison corrected. "And here is me being honest too. This ranch of yours has good bones, but it needs capital and labor to really reach its potential. You are doing a fine job keeping it going, but you could do more with the right support. Henry has the skills and the knowledge to help you build this place into something really special, and I think you have something he needs too." "What is that?" Julia asked. "A reason to put down roots," Morrison said. "A place to belong, someone to build a life with. He has been adrift for too long, working for other people, never having anything that is really his. But when he talks about this ranch, about helping you, there is something different in his voice. There is investment, there is purpose." Julia did not know what to say. Morrison was essentially giving them his blessing. And more than that, he was validating what she had been feeling but was afraid to fully acknowledge. "I care about him very much," she said quietly, "but I'm afraid of making another mistake. My judgment has not been trustworthy in the past." "Past is past," Morrison said bluntly. "What matters is what you do now. And from where I am standing, what you are doing now looks pretty damn good. You are healing. You are building. You are choosing someone who is choosing you back. That is not a mistake. That is just life happening the way it is supposed to." He tipped his hat to her and walked back to his horse, and Julia stood on the porch feeling like she had just received some kind of benediction. That evening, when Henry arrived for dinner, Julia told him about Morrison's visit. Henry laughed when she repeated what his boss had said. "He is not subtle, is he?" Henry said, shaking his head. "He has been writing me for weeks about what my intentions are with you, saying that if I am serious about you, then I need to make it clear. And if I am not serious, then I should stop spending so much time here." "Are you serious about me?" Julia asked, even though she thought she knew the answer. "More serious than I have ever been about anything in my life," Henry said. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "Julia, I love you. Not just falling in love, but actually completely in love. I love the way you laugh, the way you work, the way you think about things. I love your strength and your vulnerability and the way you keep fighting even when everything seems impossible. I love who you are, and I love who I am when I am with you." Julia felt her heart expand in her chest, so full of emotion that it almost hurt. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you held me and did not try to fix me. Just let me fall apart and promised I was not alone." Henry pulled her into his arms and held her close, and they stood like that for a long time, just breathing together, just being together. Finally, he pulled back enough to look at her face. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to merge my savings with your land and build something together. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to work side by side with you for the next 50 years. I want to have children with you if that is possible. And if it is not, I want to build a family in whatever way works for us. I want you, Julia. All of you for all the days I have left." Julia was crying, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. Yes to everything." Henry kissed her then, deep and passionate and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "We should do it soon," Henry said. "I do not want to wait. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time when you know what you want." "How soon?" Julia asked. "How about next month?" Henry suggested. "That gives us time to plan a small ceremony, to tell people, to make it official. September is beautiful here, before the weather turns cold. We could get married at the ranch, with just close friends and Rosa's cooking and maybe Morrison as a witness since he seems to think he is responsible for us getting together." Julia laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "That sounds perfect." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about how they would combine their resources, what improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, how they would divide the labor. Henry would give notice at the Morrison ranch, though Morrison had already said he expected that and bore no hard feelings. They would live in Julia's house to start, though they talked about eventually adding on a room or two, especially if they were blessed with children. The mention of children made Julia pause, old grief rising up to mingle with her new happiness. "What if I cannot give you babies?" she asked quietly. "What if my body just will not carry a pregnancy to term?" Henry took her hands again. Then we will find another way to have a family. We can adopt children who need homes. We can take in orphans or children whose parents cannot care for them. There are always kids who need love and a safe place to grow. Or we can just be the two of us and make a life that is full and meaningful in other ways. I want children, yes, but I want you more. And I will not love you any less if biology does not cooperate with our plans. You say that now, Julia said, but what if you change your mind? What if you resent me for not being able to give you what you want? I will not, Henry said firmly. I know my own heart, Julia. And my heart wants you exactly as you are, with all your strengths and all your struggles. We will face whatever comes together, and we will figure it out together. That is what marriage means. That is what love means. Julia believed him. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was setting herself up for more heartbreak, but she chose to believe him, because the alternative was to let fear rule her life, and she was done with that. She was ready to take a chance on happiness, ready to trust that this time with this man, things would be different. They set the date for the last Saturday in September, giving them 5 weeks to prepare. Julia went into town and bought fabric for a new dress, pale blue, because white felt presumptuous given her history. Rosa organized the food, recruiting several other women to help with the cooking. Morrison offered the use of his barn if they wanted a larger space, but Julia insisted on keeping it small and intimate, just a handful of people who mattered most to them. Henry moved some of his belongings to the ranch gradually over those weeks, integrating himself into Julia's space and life. They maintained propriety, with Henry sleeping in the small room that had once been Julia's father's office, but it was clear to anyone who saw them that they were already building a life together. They worked the ranch as partners, making decisions together, supporting each other's strengths, and compensating for each other's weaknesses. 3 weeks before the wedding, Julia's monthly courses were late. She tried not to let herself hope, tried not to even think about it, but the possibility hung in the air between her and Henry like a ghost. Neither of them mentioned it directly, but she caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that was half hope, half fear. When another week passed and there was still no blood, Julia finally went to see the doctor in Ardmore. He examined her and confirmed what she had suspected but was afraid to believe. She was pregnant, approximately 6 weeks along based on his estimations. "But I have lost 3 babies already," Julia said, her voice shaking. "What makes you think this one will be any different?" The doctor, a kind man named Patterson, who had delivered her after her mother died giving birth, looked at her with compassion. "I cannot make you any promises, Julia. Every pregnancy is different, and there is no way to predict what will happen. But I can tell you that you are healthy. You are eating better than you were during your previous pregnancies, based on what you have told me. And you are not dealing with the same level of stress and emotional turmoil that you were before. Those factors matter. They do not guarantee anything, but they improve your odds." "What should I do?" Julia asked. "Rest when you need to. Eat well. Do not lift heavy objects or overexert yourself. And try not to worry too much, because stress is not good for you or the baby. Beyond that, we wait and hope and pray." Julia left the doctor's office in a daze. She was pregnant. Again. And this time, the baby had been conceived in love, with a man who was committed to her, who was about to become her husband. This time felt different from the beginning, and she wanted so badly to believe that different meant better. She went to the church and sat in the quiet coolness of the sanctuary, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall. She did not know what to pray for. She was afraid to hope too much, afraid that hope would make the inevitable loss even more painful. But she was also afraid not to hope, afraid that giving in to cynicism and despair would somehow curse this fragile new life before it even had a chance. Finally, she just spoke honestly. "I do not know if you are listening," she said, "to whatever might be beyond that cross. I do not know if you care about one woman's grief or joy. But if you do, then please, please let this baby live. Let me carry this child safely into the world. Let me know the joy of holding my own baby in my arms. I am not asking for it to be easy. I am just asking for it to be possible." There was no answer, no sign, no sudden feeling of peace or certainty. But Julia felt a little lighter as she left the church, as if speaking the prayer aloud had somehow lessened the burden of carrying it alone. She decided not to tell Henry until after the wedding. It was only 2 more weeks, and she wanted their wedding day to be about their commitment to each other, not overshadowed by the anxiety and uncertainty of her pregnancy. If she lost this baby too, she did not want that grief forever attached to their marriage ceremony. And if the pregnancy continued, then telling him afterward would be an even more joyful celebration. The last 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Julia finished her dress with help from Rosa and some of the other women. Henry spent his days making final improvements to the ranch and his evenings with Julia, talking and laughing and stealing kisses. They were happy, genuinely happy, in a way that felt almost miraculous given where Julia had been just a few months ago. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, the first hints of autumn in the air. Julia woke early and stood on the porch watching the sunrise, one hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. She was going to marry Henry Vaughn today. She was going to pledge her life to a man who loved her, who knew all her flaws and failures and chose her anyway. And she was carrying his child, though he did not know it yet. The ceremony took place in the late afternoon, when the heat of the day had passed. They stood under the cottonwood trees by the creek, with Morrison serving as witness and a circuit preacher performing the brief ceremony. Rosa and her family were there, along with a handful of other ranch families Julia had befriended. It was small and simple and perfect. Julia wore her blue dress and wildflowers in her hair. Henry wore his best shirt and trousers, his boots polished to a shine. When the preacher asked if he took Julia to be his wife, Henry's voice was strong and sure as he said, "I do." And when it was Julia's turn, she looked into those steady blue eyes and said the same words with her whole heart behind them. They kissed as husband and wife while their small gathering of friends cheered, and Julia felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a blessing. This was real. This was forever. This was the beginning of the life she was meant to live. The celebration afterward was joyful and loud, with Rosa's incredible food and Morrison telling embarrassing stories about Henry's early days working for him, and even some fiddle music when Henry was persuaded to play. Julia laughed until her sides hurt and danced with her new husband under the stars, and for those few hours she forgot about everything except the joy of being newly married to a man she loved. When the guests finally left, and Julia and Henry were alone, they stood on the porch of what was now their shared home, holding hands and looking out over the land they would build their future on. "I have something to tell you," Julia said softly. "So do I," Henry said at the same time. They laughed, and Julia said, "You first." Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever challenges we face, I am in this for the long haul. I know you are scared about a lot of things, about whether you can have children, about whether I will regret choosing you, but I need you to understand that I do not have any doubts. I choose you, Julia. I choose us. And I will keep choosing us every single day for the rest of our lives." Julia felt tears well up because his words were so perfectly timed, so exactly what she needed to hear before she told him her news. "I love you," she said, "and I need you to know that I'm pregnant." Henry went completely still, his eyes widening. "What?" "I am pregnant," Julia repeated. "About 7 or 8 weeks along. I found out 3 weeks ago, but I did not want to tell you before the wedding because I did not want to jinx it, and I did not want our wedding to be about the baby. I wanted it to be about us." "You are pregnant," Henry said, and his voice was filled with wonder. Then, more urgently, "Are you all right? Is the baby all right? What did the doctor say?" "The doctor says I'm healthy and the baby seems fine, but there are no guarantees. I could still lose it like I lost the others." Julia's voice shook. "I am terrified, Henry. I want this baby so much, but I'm so afraid to hope." Henry pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. Then I will hope for both of us, he said fiercely. I will hope enough for both of us and for the baby too. And whatever happens, whatever comes, we will face it together, just like I promised. Julia clung to him, letting herself finally release all the fear and hope and desperate longing she had been holding back. What if I lose this baby too? What if I cannot do this? Then we will grieve together, Henry said, and then we will figure out what comes next. But Julia, I do not think you are going to lose this baby. I think this time is different. This time you have support and love and stability. This time you are not trying to do it alone. This time we are in it together. You really think so? Julia asked, pulling back to look at his face. I really think so, Henry said, and his certainty made her believe, just a little bit, that maybe he was right. That night, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness and care that made Julia cry from the sheer beauty of it. This was nothing like her previous encounters with men. This was love expressed through physical connection. Two people choosing each other and celebrating that choice with their bodies as well as their hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that was now theirs, Henry's hand resting gently on Julia's stomach. Our baby is in there, he said wonderingly. A whole new person that is half you and half me. If the baby survives, Julia said, unable to fully release her fear. When the baby survives, Henry corrected gently. I am claiming that, Julia. I am speaking it into existence. This baby is going to make it. You are going to carry our child full term, and we are going to be parents together. Julia wanted to believe him so badly that it physically hurt. Promise me something, she said. Anything. Promise me that if I do lose this baby, you will not try to make me feel better by saying it was meant to be or part of God's plan, or any of those empty platitudes people say when they do not know what else to do. Promise me you will just let me grieve and that you will grieve with me. I promise, Henry said immediately, and I promise that I will be here no matter what. In the grief or in the joy, I am here. That is what for better or worse means. The months that followed were a strange mixture of happiness and anxiety. Julia's pregnancy progressed each week that passed without bleeding, feeling like a small miracle. Henry was attentive and protective without being smothering, taking over the heavier ranch work and making sure Julia rested when she needed to. They continued to build their life together, making improvements to the house and planning for the future. When Julia made it to 3 months without losing the baby, she allowed herself to hope just a little. When she made it to 4 months and began to show, she started to believe that maybe this time really was different. And when she felt the first flutter of movement at 5 months, she cried tears of joy and disbelief. The baby is moving, she told Henry, grabbing his hand and pressing it to her rounded belly. Can you feel it? Henry held perfectly still, his face intent with concentration. Then his eyes lit up. I feel it, like little butterfly wings. Our baby, Julia whispered. Our baby is alive and growing and moving. I told you, Henry said, but there was no smugness in his voice, only awe and gratitude. I told you this time would be different. They shared the news with their friends then, no longer able or willing to hide Julia's growing belly. Rosa cried with happiness and immediately began knitting baby clothes. Morrison gruffly offered congratulations and said he expected their child to grow up to be a hell of a rancher. The women at church organized a small gathering to provide Julia with supplies and advice. The pregnancy was not always easy. Julia dealt with nausea and exhaustion and the constant low-level anxiety that something would still go wrong. But Henry was there through all of it, holding her hair when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet at the end of long days, talking to her belly when they were alone, and telling their child stories about the ranch they would inherit someday. Winter came cold and harsh, and they hunkered down together in their warm house, grateful for the improvements they had made before the baby came. Julia reached 6 months, then 7, then 8, and with each passing week the baby grew stronger and more active. The doctor was cautiously optimistic, saying everything looked healthy and normal. In late February of 1884, when Julia was nearly 9 months pregnant, a late-season blizzard swept through the Oklahoma Territory. Snow piled up in drifts against the house, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Julia stood at the window watching the white fury outside, one hand on her massive belly, feeling the baby kick and roll. "Are you worried?" Henry asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her as much as her size would allow. "A little," Julia admitted. "What if the baby comes during the storm? What if we cannot get to the doctor?" "Then we will handle it ourselves," Henry said calmly. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years, most of them without doctors. We have supplies, we have knowledge, and we have each other. We will be fine." As if in response to the conversation, Julia felt a strong contraction grip her belly, different from the practiced contractions she had been feeling for weeks. She gasped, and Henry immediately tensed. "Was that labor?" he asked. "I do not know," Julia said. "Maybe. It felt different from the others." Another contraction came 20 minutes later, and then another 15 minutes after that. By evening, there was no doubt. The baby was coming, and they were snowed in with no way to reach the doctor in town. Henry moved into action with impressive efficiency. He built up the fire, heated water, gathered clean linens and towels, and helped Julia into the bedroom. He had been reading everything he could find about childbirth over the past few months, preparing for exactly this scenario. And his calm competence helped Julia stay focused. The labor was long and painful, lasting through the night and into the next day. Henry stayed with Julia the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, encouraging her when she said she could not do it anymore. And when the baby finally came, sliding into the world with a loud, healthy cry just as dawn broke and the storm began to clear, Henry was the one who caught their child and placed the squirming, perfect infant on Julia's chest. "It is a boy," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son." Julia looked down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers curled into fists, the shock of dark hair already visible on the baby's head, and she felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is absolutely perfect." "He is alive," Henry said. And Julia heard all the fear and hope and prayer in those two words. "You did it, Julia. You carried him safely, and you brought him into the world. You did it." They named him Thomas Henry Vaughn after Julia's lost love and his own father, because Julia wanted to honor the past while embracing the future. Thomas was a healthy baby, strong and loud, and from the moment he entered the world, he seemed determined to make his presence known. The weeks after Thomas was born were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Julia recovered from the birth more quickly than she had expected, helped by Henry's constant support and Rosa's guidance. Henry was a natural father, patient and tender with their son, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed at night so Julia could sleep. "I did not know I could love someone so much so quickly," Henry said one night as he rocked their sleeping son. "I look at him, and I cannot even remember what my life was like before he existed." "I know exactly what you mean," Julia said. She was nursing Thomas, watching her son's tiny hand rest against her breast as he ate, and she marveled at the miracle of it all. After 3 losses, after so much grief and pain, she had been given this gift. She had been given the chance to be a mother, and she was determined not to waste a single moment of it. As Thomas grew from an infant into a baby and then a toddler, Julia and Henry's ranch prospered. They expanded their herd, added on to the house, and became respected members of the community. Morrison retired and sold them a portion of his land at a generous price, saying he wanted to see it go to people who would care for it properly. Rosa moved into a small house on their property, becoming Thomas's grandmother in all but blood and helping care for the child she had come to love as her own grandchild. When Thomas was 2 years old, Julia found herself pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more cautious excitement. She carried the baby without incident, and in the spring of 1886 she delivered a daughter they named Sarah Ruth, after Julia's mother and Henry's sister. Sarah was as different from Thomas as night from day, quiet where he was boisterous, careful where he was reckless, but Julia loved her with the same fierce intensity. Their family was complete, or so Julia thought, but life had more surprises in store. When Sarah was 3 and Thomas was 5, a wagon appeared at their ranch carrying a man and woman who were clearly struggling. The man explained that they were heading west to California, hoping to make a new start, but their supplies had run out and their wagon had broken an axle. They had 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 2, and they were desperate. Julia and Henry took them in without hesitation, feeding the family and helping repair the wagon. But as they got to know the family over the next few days, it became clear that something was wrong. The children were too thin, too quiet, too wary. The parents drank heavily and fought constantly. And when the wagon was finally ready to go, the mother pulled Julia aside and made a shocking request. "Would you take our oldest girl?" the woman asked. "Her name is Emma. She is 8 years old and she is a good worker, a good girl. But we cannot feed all these children, and I think she would have a better life here with you than traveling to California with us." Julia was stunned. "You want us to take your daughter?" "Please," the woman said, and there were tears in her eyes. "I know it is a terrible thing to ask, but I can see that you are good people, that you have a good home here. Emma would be safe with you. She would have food and a bed and a chance at a real life. With us, she just has more hunger and uncertainty." Julia went to find Henry and told him about the conversation. They looked at each other for a long moment, and then Henry nodded. "If the girl is willing, we will take her." Emma was willing, though it was clear she was scared and confused about being left behind by her parents. But she was also smart and resilient, and over the weeks and months that followed, she slowly integrated into the Vaughn family. Thomas and Sarah adored her, and Emma blossomed under the consistent care and affection that Julia and Henry provided. A year later, they legally adopted Emma, making her a Vaughn in name as well as in their hearts. And 2 years after that, they took in twin boys whose mother had died and whose father could not care for them. The twins, James and John, were 4 years old and inseparable, and they fit into the family chaos with surprising ease. By 1892, Julia and Henry had 5 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. Their house was loud and busy and full of life in a way Julia could never have imagined during those dark days in 1883 when she thought she would never be a mother. She looked at her family gathered around the dinner table, at Henry at the head telling stories that made the children laugh, at the faces of the kids she had borne and the kids she had chosen, and she felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. One evening after the children were in bed, Julia and Henry sat on the porch watching the sunset, just like they had done countless times before. Henry took her hand and kissed her knuckles, and Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember that first morning when you came to my ranch?" Julia asked. "When I had just lost my 3rd baby and I thought my life was over?" "I remember," Henry said quietly. "I remember thinking that I had never seen anyone look so completely broken." "I was broken," Julia said, "but you helped me put the pieces back together. You showed me that life could be good again, that I could be whole again, that happiness was still possible." "We helped each other," Henry corrected. "You gave me a place to belong, a purpose beyond just working for wages. You gave me a family and a future. You saved me as much as I saved you." Julia squeezed his hand. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not stopped here that morning, if you had just kept riding to the Morrison Ranch?" "All the time," Henry admitted. "And then I thank whatever force in the universe brought me to your door at exactly the moment you needed someone to hold you while you cried. Because that moment changed everything. That moment gave me the life I have now, and I would not trade it for anything." "Not even when the twins are fighting and Sarah is crying and Thomas is trying to climb on the roof?" Julia teased. Henry laughed. "Not even then. Especially not then, actually, because those chaotic moments are proof that we did it. We built something real and lasting out of grief and loss and loneliness. We created a family. Julia looked out over their land, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, at the barn they had rebuilt together, at the house they had expanded to accommodate their growing family. She thought about all the ways her life had changed since that terrible night in July of 1883 when she lost her third baby. She had gone from believing she was cursed, that she would never know the joy of motherhood, to having more children than she had ever imagined possible. I used to think that losing those 3 babies was the worst thing that ever happened to me, Julia said softly. And it was terrible, genuinely terrible. But now I wonder if maybe it happened the way it was supposed to. Because if I had successfully carried any of those pregnancies, I would not have been free to marry you. And Thomas and Sarah would not exist, and we would not have Emma or James or John. Our family would look completely different. Or maybe those losses were just losses, Henry said gently. Maybe they did not have to happen for this to happen. Maybe we can be grateful for where we ended up without having to justify the pain that came before. Julia considered that. You are right. I do not need to find meaning in my suffering. I can just acknowledge that I suffered and that I survived, and that I found happiness anyway. Exactly, Henry said. The grief does not disappear just because good things came after. You are allowed to mourn those 3 babies for the rest of your life if you need to, and you are also allowed to be joyful about the family we have. Both things can be true at the same time. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the Oklahoma sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. From inside the house came the sound of one of the children calling out in their sleep, and Julia automatically started to rise, but Henry gently pulled her back down. I will check, he said. You stay here and enjoy the sunset. Julia watched him go inside, this man who had appeared in her life at her lowest moment and had somehow become her everything. She thought about the journey they had traveled together from that first morning when he held her while she cried to this moment, a decade later with a house full of children and a ranch that was thriving and a love that had only grown stronger with time. She remembered his words from that terrible day, words that had seemed almost impossible to believe at the time, but that had proven to be profoundly true. We have each other, he had said, and it had sounded so simple, so insufficient in the face of her overwhelming grief, but it had been enough. It had been everything. Because having each other had given them the foundation to build a life on, to weather storms and celebrate joys and create a family that was bound together by choice as much as by blood. Henry came back out and settled beside her again. James had a bad dream. I settled him down. You are a good father, Julia said, not for the first time. I had a good example, Henry said, pulling her close. Your father raised you to be strong and capable and independent, and I am trying to do the same for our children. I want them to know they can survive anything, that they can build lives that matter, that they can choose love even when it seems impossible. I think they already know that, Julia said as they see us living it every day. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Julia thought about all the women out there who might be struggling with loss the way she had struggled. Women who had lost babies or husbands or parents or hope. Women who felt broken and alone and certain that happiness would never find them again. And she wished she could tell them what she had learned, that grief could coexist with joy, that loss did not mean life was over, that sometimes the worst moments led to paths that eventually took you somewhere beautiful. But more than anything, she wished she could tell them what Henry had told her that first morning. The simple truth that had become the foundation of everything good in her life. You are not alone. You do not have to carry this by yourself. There are people who will hold you while you cry and help you stand back up and walk beside you until you find your way again. In the years that followed, Julia and Henry's ranch continued to grow and prosper. Their children grew up strong and healthy, each one finding their own path in life. Thomas became a rancher like his parents, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Henry aged. Sarah married a teacher and moved to Oklahoma City, but she visited often and named her first child Julia. Emma became a nurse, dedicating her life to helping others the way she had been helped. The twins went into business together, opening a store in Ardmore that became one of the most successful in the territory. Julia and Henry grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. They sat on their porch on countless evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, talking about their day or their children, or sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. And every so often, Julia would think back to that terrible night in 1883 when she lost her third baby and thought her life was over. She was grateful now for all of it, even the pain, because it had led her here. To this life, this family, this man who had held her in her darkest moment and said the words that changed everything, "We have each other." On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and Julia stood in the middle of it all, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Henry found her in the chaos and pulled her aside, leading her out to the porch where they could have a moment of relative quiet. 25 years, he said, shaking his head in wonder. A quarter of a century since I stopped at your ranch with a lame horse and ended up falling in love with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. I was a mess when you met me, Julia said. You were grieving, Henry corrected, as he had done so many times over the years. There is a difference, and even in your grief I could see your strength, your resilience, your capacity for love. I knew from that first day that you were someone special. You could not have known that, Julia protested, but she was smiling. I did, though, Henry insisted. I saw you break down completely, let yourself be vulnerable with a stranger, and then pull yourself back together and offer me water and hospitality despite your pain. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. Julia leaned against him, feeling his arms come around her the way they had done thousands of times over the past 25 years. Do you have any regrets? She asked. Anything you wish had been different? Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. I wish you had not had to suffer those 3 losses. I wish I could have spared you that pain. But I do not regret anything that came after. Every single day with you has been a gift, Julia. Every moment of our life together has been exactly what I wanted, even the hard moments, especially the hard moments, actually, because those were the times when we learned who we really were to each other. I love you, Julia said, and the words held 25 years of history, of joy and sorrow and everyday life lived side by side. I love you too, Henry said, and I am grateful every single day that I stopped at your ranch that morning. Best decision I ever made. They stood there holding each other while the celebration continued inside, and Julia thought about the full circle her life had traveled. From devastating loss to overwhelming love, from believing she would never be a mother to having more family than she had ever dreamed possible, from loneliness to belonging, from grief to joy. She had learned that healing was not a straight line, that you could mourn and celebrate at the same time, that loss did not have to define you even though it changed you. She had learned that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that sometimes strangers became soulmates, that vulnerability was strength instead of weakness. But most importantly, she had learned that you did not have to face life's hardest moments alone, that sometimes the most powerful words in the world were the simplest ones, that when everything fell apart, what mattered most was having someone who would hold you together and remind you that no matter what happened, you had each other. And that, Julia thought as she stood in the arms of the man who had saved her by simply being present in her pain, was the greatest gift of all. The sun set on another day in Oklahoma, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple, and Julia Vaughn stood with Henry beside her and their family around them and knew that her life was exactly what it was meant to be. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and rich and full of love. And that was more than enough.